And my mom, I was talking to my mom today, so there's
well, the car is not.
she said, my mom was,
Isn't that the situation right here? That's the same section that's going on.
she was just about 15.
This is, she had the same thing with them.
She said that the, I don't know what time it aired. It didn't air a lot.
Yeah. There, I always saw their times as rockers. So far, they're just to the side of the robbing table. So I guess in the middle there's.
So it was in the end, you know, so they,
It's all fun and
early
really,
to watch.
but it didn't sell by.
Yes. So the one in May or something was the letter to
We said that about
Yes,
one
I
thing.
saw it as well. That's so interesting.
That was the other one. Isn't this the one here?
That is the one.
Isn't that her?
With this.
Oh, actually, this is all.
I mean, I'm sure, you know,
Oh, yeah,
yeah. And so, one way is, so, in honor, I think of this
Yeah, I'm guessing we're not.
Now on, yeah, last call.
but it's been on
I didn't go to my society. I try not to.
I get these like three, and one of the ones this week was, what country in the world has the most islands?
I looked at Coronation.
Believe it or not, it's not an island country, it's Sweden. Sweden has more islands than
He's Irish.
And one article went on, very actual account. But one of the ones, they have a big land, Arctic island, and they have, the biggest one is a big head. And it's white.
I met a friend out of Madison after, and so I walked through the park.
Because you can make a vacation in Sweden and just ride on
I
the
drove into the park across from the Eldorado, and I do the wildlife corridor, which is that lane below the reservoir with all the cherry trees, and they were.
Stockholm itself is 14 islands.
South part.
It's not on mainland, it's a mainland.
The running track, and that brings me out to 90 Street.
14 islands that are connected with bridges and
Heavenly Rest.
boats.
Matt was our rector, who just
Yeah,
retired.
more
We
than
live in Bishop of New York. So we were very attached to just the girl, but he can do a good job as bishop, and now we're going to have a new rector. So we're searching.
Good evening, everyone. Hello. My name is Kate Hill, and I serve as the director of the Church Club of New York, which is an organization founded in 1887 that is dedicated to the lay Episcopal community, both here in New York City and then to some extent around the country. We have members in many states. However, our membership is certainly concentrated here in New York, and it's a club that's open to anyone who's interested. So if you at any point find yourself interested in the church club, we would be glad to have you take a look at our website. You could speak to me today. The president of our board of trustees, Nick Burns, is here. And we also have several other members here in attendance. So we're really grateful to the parish of St. John in the Village for welcoming us, not only tonight, but also the parish has provided lots of welcome and hospitality to the church club over the years, and we're very grateful for that. And I think I speak for the Board of Trustees in thanking Father Graeme Napier for his hospitality and that of the parish. And we're certainly looking forward to that tonight. In addition to silencing your cell phones, if you don't mind, we also do have access to a restroom. The one that will be best during this evening's program is through the door, which is open back behind you. And we'll enjoy a talk in a moment, which I will introduce in just a second. And after that, we will have a brief reception out perhaps in the courtyard, or certainly in this area through here. And will you, forgive me, I can't remember what it's called. What is the atrium? The atrium. Thank you. So, even better. It's a lovely space, and we're glad to be here. So thank you for having us. We have lots of members of the parish here with us tonight, which is fantastic. So thank you for joining the program. So I'd like to introduce the talk that we're going to have. First, I just want to mention briefly one upcoming event that we have, which is May 3rd. It's an annual dinner that the church club offers. It will be at Trinity Church's Parish Hall this year, and our speaker will be Bishop Rose Hudson-Wilkin of Dover, who is also bishop in Canterbury, and she will be coming to speak with us. And it's a really exciting opportunity to hear from someone who I think is esteemed on many levels, but is, I think, widely known for being the first Black woman bishop in the Anglican Church, the Church of England anyway, maybe not the Anglican Church, but the Church of England. And I have had the honor of speaking with her on the phone. I'm very excited for her visit, and if you are interested in hearing her speak, please consider coming to that event. You can find more information about it on our website, which is churchclubny.org. So, for tonight's event, the coronation of Charles III, as many of you already know, will take place on Saturday, May 6th in Westminster Abbey. And the rites of the coronation of British and, in the past, Scottish and English monarchs are Christian rites, which take place in the context of the Anglican liturgy. And Father Graeme Napier, as many of you know, the rector of this parish, will right now be talking with us about the rites of coronation, their history, development, and many related topics. As someone who's worked at Westminster Abbey, he's really able, I think, to give us a very personal view of what can be expected from those coronation rites, and I'm really interested to hear from him about that. He makes the point that this is a very infrequent liturgy, which I think makes it especially interesting to learn about from someone who has, I think, some particular knowledge of it. So regarding Father Graeme himself, he was born and raised in Ireland and is a graduate of Magdalen College, Oxford, and was trained for the priesthood at St. Stephen's House, which is the Anglo-Catholic seminary in Oxford. He served at St. Andrew's Cathedral in Inverness before moving to the Anglican Church of Australia to serve as an assistant priest, followed by serving as an interim rector at Christ Church St. Lawrence, which is a busy inner-city Anglo-Catholic parish, and then called to Westminster Abbey as a minor canon and successor. He was responsible there for daily worship, special services, and pastoral care for staff and volunteers at the Abbey. Later appointed precentor of St. George's Cathedral in Perth, Father Graeme returned to Australia to oversee all of the worship and special events in that cathedral. And he spent an academic year in full-time study at Nashotah House, which is in Wisconsin, a seminary of the Episcopal Church. And at that time, spent some time here in New York in the archives of General Theological Seminary, and then in the parish of Cowley St. John, Oxford, before becoming rector here in 2018 at St. John in the Village. So I'm very pleased to, not really welcome since this is his parish, but to invite you, Father Graeme, to come up and give us this talk, which I think many of us have been looking forward to. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate, and welcome to all to St. John's in the Village and to this Revelation Gallery, one of our art spaces here at St. John's. This talk is to give you a kind of heads up and an understanding of what you might expect to see if you tune in to the coronation of Charles III on Saturday the 6th of May, either at 6 a.m. live or in some kind of delayed recording you might see afterwards. It'll be on the BBC website and the Westminster Abbey website as well. Before I launch into the talk, just a plug for our events on that day. At 5 o'clock on that Saturday we will have festal evensong and garden party in our lovely St. Benedict's courtyard. Details of that will be shared anon. I want to begin really in the prehistory of coronations to give us an understanding of why that funny little island in the Thames and the building that sits on it has become the locus of all these coronations since the 11th century, and why that is so fixed. Thorney Island is an island in the Thames. One of its sides is the River Thames, two of its sides are the River Tyburn. The River Tyburn is underground, so as you approach Westminster Abbey, you think you're just on land beside the Thames, but you're actually on an island. In the 10th century, it was very clearly an island, and well outside the walled city of London. And the Benedictine monks who established themselves there in the 900s, perhaps with the patronage of St. Dunstan, then Archbishop of Canterbury, put themselves there because they were out of the way, outside the city, on a swampy island, out of the way, a nowhere place. So that's the first important thing to happen on Thorney Island, is the establishment of a Benedictine monastery, and certainly with national patronage under St. Dunstan when he was Archbishop of Canterbury. He dies in 988. There's certainly an abbey there in his time. The next most important thing to happen on that island is in the reign of Edward the Confessor. Edward the Confessor is a 11th century king of England, the last English king of England, in fact, even though he was only half English. He was crowned in Winchester, the capital of England, and during his reign he built himself a royal palace on Thorney Island, beside that monastery of the monks, the Benedictine monks, and also, importantly, decided to rebuild that Romanesque building, to rebuild that plain building in a grand Romanesque style, like his cousins in France would have. So Edward the Confessor set about the project, the double building project, of a lovely new Romanesque abbey for the monks of Westminster and a royal palace for himself on the same island, not in his capital Winchester, not in the walled city of London, but in this funny place. Edward is a very pious man, a kind of crowned saint or a sainted king, attended services with the monks of the abbey, a very holy man, and he had visions and dreams and wanted to go on pilgrimage to Jerusalem, never did, and building this abbey and this whole holy precinct of the Palace of Westminster and the Abbey of Westminster was his spiritual dream and foundation for the church. So he himself was not crowned there, neither was his predecessors. Predecessor kings of England had been crowned in Bath, for example, King Edgar in 973, whose liturgy of whose coronation we have part of. It's the first recorded history, but other English towns were the sites of coronations. And the last, not in Thorney Island, was Edward the Confessor himself, being crowned in the capital city of Winchester. Edward doesn't live to see the completion of his new lovely Romanesque abbey. He dies in 1065. That's why you know the date 1066, because the country is put into confusion of succession crisis when Edward dies. His nearest relative is a cousin, the Duke of Normandy, but the most powerful family in the land are an Anglo-Saxon family. What happens after Edward's death is that Harold becomes king of the English and has himself crowned, not in Winchester or in Bath, but in Westminster Abbey, setting a trend thereafter. because by then it's become to be felt as Thorney Island is both a spiritual and a secular home of the English, because King Edward the Confessor lived, prayed, died, and was entombed in that abbey. Harold, of course, as you know, in 1066 is defeated by Edward's cousin, the Duke of Normandy, who then has himself crowned in Westminster Abbey, also the Romanesque building on that site. The Norman kings were very keen to ingratiate themselves with Anglo-Saxon nobles by upping the cultus of St. Edward. Edward was canonized in 1161 and moved to a shrine in that Romanesque church. Later, in 1269, Henry III decides to rebuild that church and to re-honour Edward the Confessor. This is building up the cultus of Edward the Confessor and reaffirming the place of Westminster Abbey as the coronation church. So Edward knocks down, Henry III, 1260s, knocks down the old Romanesque French-style abbey and builds a French-style Gothic abbey in its place. And what he builds is really a theatre for coronations. So there's quite a lot more of the abbey now than there was in 1269, but the important parts that he built were the shrine of St. Edward, the sanctuary, the crossing, 2 transepts, and a choir, so a cruciform Gothic shape. The choir, the crossing, and the transepts are all at one level, and the sanctuary, which we call the sacrarium in Westminster Abbey, is up about 2 meters, 2 feet, yards off the ground, and behind that stands the shrine of St. Edward the Confessor. So Henry was building a theatre for coronations with Edward the Confessor himself enshrined and presiding over everything that happened. Later on, west of the choir, they built a nave, and it extended bay by bay through the centuries until Hawkesmoor completed those rather unfortunate towers at the west end. In 1296, after this building has been consecrated and Edward re-enshrined, Edward the first numbered Edward, in one of his wars with Scotland, captures the stone of Scone. Now, monarchs of Scotland had traditionally been crowned in the abbey at Scone upon this stone. This stone is about this size, surrounded by legend. It is said to be the stone upon which Jacob laid his head when he was on his way to Haran and had his vision of the angels ascending and descending from that place. Not much recorded history about the stone, except when Edward I captures it and brings it to the abbey. He then has a special chair made to house this stone. That is the chair we have still to this day, called the coronation chair. I'm sure you've seen pictures of it if you've not seen it in person, because it's always been on public display in Westminster Abbey. It's a wooden chair with arms and a tall back, and a slot beneath the seat the size of the stone of Scone. The English monarchs didn't actually sit on it until in the 1390s, Henry IV, but it was possessed by the English monarch and kept in Westminster Abbey. After they started sitting on it at coronations from the 1390s, they built the wooden platform which Charles will sit on at this coronation rather than sitting on the stone itself. Previously, they had sat on the stone itself. So this construction Edward I builds for the coronation at Westminster Abbey and eventually housing the stone of Scone. That's in the 1290s. By the 1300s, we have an extant document, the Liber Regalis, which details the ceremony of the consecrations of monarchs. So the first good written evidence after the hagiography of King Edward, which is not really historical. This Liber Regalis was then translated into English in the reign of James VI and I, but a Latin manuscript exists from the 1300s detailing the coronations. And by then, all the irreducible elements of coronation are already in the rite. And every coronation has been different, none have been the same, but there are irreducible elements which certainly date back into the 1300s. So certainly by the year, say 1400, you have a liturgy, a church, which is the theatre of coronation, and already many coronations having happened into it. So by 1400, this is set. Westminster Abbey, this Gothic church, is the place where kings of England and nominal overlords of Scotland have their coronation. The most important aspect for us to realise, who might have seen just cinema clips of Elizabeth II's coronation, is this happens, and has always happened, in the context of the Eucharist. When we saw the cinema clips in 1953, they extracted the most exciting bits, and I think left out all the actual Eucharist itself. But coronations are done in the context of a Christian Eucharist, and the coronation rite itself is what I would call semi-sacramental. The core of the rite is not the putting on of a crown or any other parts of regalia, nor is it the acclamation by the people. The core of the rite is the anointing with oil of chrism which can only be consecrated by bishops. So there's a quasi-sacramental thing going on in this rite, and it's important to note that falls at the heart of the rite. And certainly up until 1953, that's been invisible to most people because the anointing has been concealed with a canopy. We'll see what happens this time. I'll come to that in due course. So that's the background, and that's a liturgy and a building fixed on Thorney Island. So that is the locus of coronations and the kind of blueprint of the liturgy within the context of the Christian Eucharist. So moving on to today, in my day at the Abbey we had what was called Operation Golden Orb, which were secret plannings for the coronation. But really we dealt with the coronation of Elizabeth II, annotated as to which part of it had come in when, what was ancient, what was thought to be irreducible, rather than a draft of the next coronation, because there was no point in doing that, because it would be the monarch himself who had to actually sign off in it. So the most useful document to keep on the go was an annotated version of the most recent coronation, noting what's ancient, what was innovative at the time, and what's essential and what's not essential. So that's what we began looking at in September of last year. The Archbishop of Canterbury and the Dean of Westminster, as well as the monarch and the Duke of Norfolk, who's the Earl Marshal, are the people responsible for the high-level planning of this event. So on the 8th of September last year, Charles III became king of 15 nations, immediately upon the death of Elizabeth II. The monarch never dies, so accession is immediate. That's important to note when we're talking about the coronation. The coronation right now is not regifacient. It does not make somebody the king. Charles II is already the king, and the coronation rite is God's blessing and the people's acclamation of the person who is already the monarch. The rite of coronation is not today regifacient, although it might have been thought to be so in the past, with all its elements coming together. So Charles is the king of 15 nations, called the Commonwealth Realms. Just so you know, they are one of them in Europe, the United Kingdom, a number in the Pacific, Australia, New Zealand, the Solomon Islands, Tuvalu, and Papua New Guinea, and the rest are here in the Americas: Antigua and Barbuda, the Bahamas, Belize, Canada, Grenada, Jamaica, St. Kitts and Nevis, St. Lucia, and St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Until quite recently, we had Barbados in that as well, but Barbados left the Commonwealth realms and became a republic. In those realms, Charles III is king and head of state, and they all have elected heads of government as well. Democratically, Westminster system elected heads of government, but Charles is head of state and also has, in most of them, a governor or governors or a governor general as his representative in those countries. Most of them, all of them are countries that have had historical colonial British history, and that's roughly the reason why they are Commonwealth realms today. The wider Commonwealth of Nations, 53 or 54 nations, is more varied than that, most of them with British connections, but some, like Rwanda and Mozambique, with no British colonial history at all, but who wanted to join those nations. Charles III is head of the Commonwealth of Nations, that group of 53 or 54 self-nominating nations all in one family together. So Charles is already king. It takes a while to plan a coronation and to get all the things together, the liturgy and some objects which have to be made new each time. I'll go through some of the important paraphernalia or objects, and later on with the liturgy look at them in maybe slightly more detail. But if we look at the hardware of the coronation, the most important thing is the Abbey itself, Henry III's lovely coronation church. As I said, the crossing between the two transepts, it's the same level as the choir, so the ground floor, and the sanctuary is 2 yards above that. For coronations, the sanctuary has been extended out into the crossing to create essentially an apron stage. So the monarch, whose 3 chairs at coronation are at a level above the ground floor of the Abbey, on the platform and in the sacrarium itself. That will be raised up. So that's a difference in the structure of the Abbey. Previous coronations, they tried to cram as many people into this building as they possibly could, and they built galleries and all sorts of structures, doing some harm to the building to get some 4,000 or more people into a building that normally seats 2,000. This time it will be 2,000 people in the building, everybody else online. So the building is the most important part of the hardware. It is the theatre in which it's set, and the props of the theatre are various. The most essential part of the rite is the anointing with chrism, which the Archbishop of Canterbury does upon the monarch. Chrism is made anew for this. It didn't stop at the Reformation when we stopped having a rite for making chrism oil. Archbishop of Canterbury still had to keep doing it because monarchs still needed to be chrismated. So we've been doing it all the time. For this coronation, the oil has already been made jointly by the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Greek Patriarch of Jerusalem. And it was made in Jerusalem by these two acting together from olives grown on the Mount of Olives, where Charles, through his father, had family connections. That's a nod to his both Greek and Jerusalem connections. So the oil of chrism was made some time ago and is now in the Abbey waiting for use. In the past it had different recipes. Oil of chrism is essentially olive oil perfumed with sweet floral oils, but sometimes in the past it has had animal elements, such as the ambergris from sperm whales or glands from civet cats. Charles III has decided that his chrism should not contain animal products. As you know, he's slightly vegetarian and also environmentally friendly, so there's no bits of civet cats or sperm whales in the oil that's been prepared, but there were in the past. The ambergris from whales is what perfumiers use to stabilize sweet perfumes and so on, so it had been there in the past. It's a very practical thing of making the chemistry work. The next part of the paraphernalia is, of course, the coronation chair, which I've talked about, this wooden chair built by Edward I with a slot for the stone of scone. It was therefore Edward II who was the first to be crowned upon it. And it's always been in the Abbey, with the stone of scone in it since the 1390s. There's stories about the stone of scone which need to be told. It's possible kidnapping and return in the 20th century. But the important historical things are its capture in 1296. It remained in the Abbey for exactly 700 years, and nicely, in 1996, was given back to Scotland. And it lives in Edinburgh Castle with the Scottish crown jewels. It will come back to the Abbey for the coronation and be slotted into the chair where it belongs, for which the chair was made. And then afterwards, I think next year the plan is to put it back near Scone. Scone is a small town, and the Abbey is no longer there. It was dissolved at the Reformation, and the stone, once it's finished with for this coronation, will go back to a special site in Perth, which is the nearest big city near to Scone. So you'll see it in the chair at the Abbey. That chair at the coronation faces the altar. That's the chair in which the anointing and the investure happen. It faces the altar, not the people, because this is a relationship between the monarch and God at that point. Crowns. None of the crowns you'll see are ancient. everything ancient was destroyed by Cromwell in the 17th century. So the king will have two crowns in the day. One is the crown for being crowned, and the other is for leaving the abbey in state. So he'll be crowned with St. Edward's crown. Clearly this is named after St. Edward the Confessor, and before the Reformation there were variations of this relic of St. Edward the Confessor, his crown. But that was all sold, lost, destroyed after the Civil War. At the Restoration, when Charles II became king, new paraphernalia had to be made. And the crown that we call St. Edward's crown today is the crown made for the coronation of the English coronation of Charles II in 1661. He'd been crowned in Scotland as King of Scotland before that. Although that crown for Charles II is St. Edward's crown, the coronation crown, some monarchs chose not to wear it because it was too heavy and uncomfortable. So it hasn't been worn universally since Charles II. Queen Victoria chose not to wear it, Queen Anne chose not to wear it because of its weight. There was then also the imperial state crown, with which Charles will leave the Abbey, having changed from St. Edward's crown in St. Edward's Shrine into an imperial state crown. And the one that he'll be using is the one made in 1937. The Germany made anew. It contains, for those who are interested in jewels, it contains one of the Cullinan diamonds, namely Cullinan II, put into the imperial state crown. So those are the king's two crowns, but don't get good off by crowns. They're not as important as anointing. The Queen Consort, commonly called the Queen, she will have a crown as well, and that is a crown. She had various choices. Generally in the past, crowns were made afresh for Queen's Consort, but sometimes they've been reused or upcycled. And she could have worn the crown that the Queen Mother had worn in 1937, but that contains the Koh-i-Noor diamond, which is a very contentious diamond. India, maybe Pakistan, maybe Bangladesh, claim ownership of this diamond. So to avoid contention, that crown is not being used, and instead she's repurposing a crown that was made for Queen Mary, the wife of George VI. It's been altered by adding 3 Cullinan diamonds. Cullinan 3, 4 and 5 are set in that crown, and they belonged personally to Elizabeth II. So it's thought that using that crown with those 3 diamonds is Camilla's homage to Elizabeth II. So those are some of the objects, probably the most important objects, of the theatre of coronation, the drama of coronation, the chrism being the most important. Then there's the rite and the language. So it's always been in a Eucharistic rite, as have the coronations and anointing of Byzantine emperors, and later in the West, Christian monarchs. The British, the Scots and English have always done that. The Scottish and English traditions come together in a number of different ways. James VI of Scotland becomes James I of England in the early 17th century, and the 2 crowns are united. He's already King of Scotland, then he's crowned King of England. Later in the reign of Queen Anne, who's a Queen Regnant, in 1707, the 2 parliaments are combined and the nations are combined into one united kingdom. And thereafter, there is no King of England and no King of Scotland. Queen Anne was the last Queen of England. The monarchs since have been queens or kings of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, or more recently, Great Britain and Northern Ireland. Still retaining the Eucharistic rite. When I mentioned James VI, you're in the era of the Reformation. So pre-Reformation, this is the Latin Mass. That's the context of coronations. And yes, the Latin Mass does vary a little bit from one part of England to another. There's the rite of Hereford, the rite of Sarum, and Roman rites and so on. By the late Reformation, the Sarum rite, coming from Salisbury Cathedral, was preeminent, and most of those pre-Reformation coronations were in the context of what we would call a Sarum Mass, a Latin Mass. Then you get a difficulty with the Reformation and the change in language of the English Church. So Edward VI, the boy king, son of Henry VIII, had the first English rite, although part of it's lost, we're not really sure, but we think it was in English. But then, in this flip-flopping period in the Reformation, both Mary and Elizabeth have the Latin rite. Queen Mary died, it was a Roman Catholic, therefore she had the Latin Mass, in which her coronation was. She died in 1558, there wasn't enough time to get Elizabeth crowned by having a new rite made. She was crowned in the Eucharist in the Latin rite in 1559. Then the rite becomes the English prayer book, the prayer books of 1549, 1552, 1560, and so on. The one exception in the post-Reformation period is the lovely exception of George I in 1714. He couldn't speak English, so there was no point, they didn't want him to have to go through the rite in English when the only language he had was German. But because Latin was a common language to scholars, not so much the church, but to scholars across Europe, the Latin rite was used again for George I in 1714, really only because he couldn't speak English. A good question for today arises from this consideration. In the past, coronations have been in the Eucharistic rite of the church at the time. And until the late 20th century, there was only one at any given time. I mentioned the prayer books of 1549, 1552, 1560, 1604, 1662, which is still with us. These only have one rite of the Eucharist. They don't have multiple options like we do in our American prayer books, or like common worship nowadays does in the Church of England. So in the past there was not any choice as to which Eucharistic rite the coronation would be in. But today, in the Church of England, there is lots of choice. You could do 1662, you could do a kind of modern, rearranged version of it in modern language or in early modern English, or you could do one of the new rites from common worship. The choice is there. I have suspicions about what might happen, and I'll come back to that when we're talking about music, because the music that's been commissioned gives something away about, perhaps about the rite of Eucharist that will happen. For a long period in this post-Reformation time, the rites of coronation and the rites of Eucharist have been intersticed. So, the entry, the recognition by the people, the oath the monarch swears, and the giving of a Bible have all been the first things to happen, and then the Eucharist begins properly with the Collect for Purity, and all the liturgy of the Word, up to including the Creed and the sermon, if there is one, happens after that. So those first things, which are not sacramental in terms of the monarch, the entry, the recognition, you're undoubted king, the oath that the monarch takes before God, and the giving of the Bible, they all happen first, and then there is the liturgy of the Word, the beginning of the Eucharist, up to the Creed or the sermon, if there be a sermon. Only then do we launch in, after caesura, to the liturgy of the sacrament, which contains the sacramental parts of coronation, followed by the sacramental parts of the Eucharist. So after the liturgy of the Word, we're back into coronation with anointing, with holy oil, investiture and crowning, enthroning and homage, and then dealing with a queen consort, if there is one. And then the rest of the Eucharist can continue. We're into the offertory. So I'll just repeat those, how it all interstices. The entry, recognition by the people, the oath that the king will make, and the giving of a Bible. And then the Eucharist begins properly, up to and including sermon and creed. Then we're back in coronation, anointing with holy oil, investiture and crowning, enthroning on a new throne, not the coronation chair, and homage by all who are present. And then, if there is one, the anointing and crowning of a queen consort. And then we're at the offertory, and the Eucharist can begin, with monarch helping in some ways in that Eucharist. Much of the regalia, and I've been through some of these objects, is kept in Tower of London, and some is kept in the Abbey, and this all coalesces into the Abbey on the day. Some of it probably kept in chambers at the West End, Jerusalem and Jericho chambers for safety, and brought in by clerics, Archbishop of Canterbury, Archbishop of York, and by some of the clergy of the Abbey. And some is positioned in the shrine of St. Edward, right behind the sacrarium where it's handy to be got, to be brought out at the time that it's needed. But also because St Edward's shrine is the kind of holy of holies in the Abbey, and having things like St Edward's crown, which is really Charles II's, there is significant. So the monarch, and in this case the monarch's wife as well, king and queen consort, have to come in. The traditional text for this entrance is the gradual psalm, Letato Sum, Psalm 122. I was glad when they said unto me, we will go into the house of the Lord. This has been used as a text in Latin and in English for many, many coronations. And certainly in all the modern day coronations has been set to music by composers chosen for the occasion and used as the entry of the monarch into the Abbey after all the other guests have arrived and been seated. In the reign of James VI and I, it became the custom for the boys of Westminster School, called the King's Scholars if there's a king on the throne, or the Queen's Scholars if there's a queen on the throne, to shout the Vivats. So Vivat Rex, long live the king, and Vivat Regina, long live the queen, are shouts shouted by these 40 scholars of Westminster School. Westminster School is a public school, which means a private school of great prestige, which sits in the grounds of Westminster Abbey. And it's very expensive to go to, except for the 40 scholars, 40 boys, who get free places by academic competition and merit. And one of their jobs is to shout the Vivats at coronations. At present, a lot of boys began their life as Queen's Scholars, and then last September they changed to King's Scholars. And they had the job of shouting these Vivats. It looks like this business began in James VI's reign, and it also looks like later, still in the 17th century, these Vivats were incorporated into pieces of music. So Henry Purcell has a setting of this I Was Glad, and the manuscripts we have come down to us don't show this, but musicologists think that this was interpolated by Vivats being shouted or sung by the boys of Westminster School, the 40 scholars. That school was founded by Elizabeth I. That's why it's as late as James VI and I, her successor, that this tradition grows up, because there weren't any such boys before Elizabeth I, really. So we think these Vivats began then and have continued ever since, and also have been incorporated into a piece of music. So what's meant to happen is the music churns away, and by the time you get the monarch up into the crossing of the Abbey, then you have the Vivats to kind of pre-acclamation. I'll talk more about that when we're talking about music for this coming coronation. First part of the rite to happen is the recognition. When the monarch is presented in the middle of the platform, and we are told, this is your undoubted king. There used to be cheerings, and God Save the King and God Save the Queen at that point. That will probably happen again, where the people will give their recognition by saying, God Save the King. In the deep past, that was a very significant, almost regifacient moment, because the lords of the realm had to say, yes, this is our king, not somebody else who could have been chosen. That's the acclamation or recognition. So once the people in the Abbey and online have acknowledged this person is the king, which he already is by law, that's the acclamation done. Then the monarch makes an oath, which is kind of both to God and to the people. And this oath has changed substantially over time. It used to be an oath just to God, and divine right kings promised to obey God in ruling with justice and mercy. But as the monarchy, as divine right monarchy gave way to constitutional monarchy, the oath changed to the monarch swearing essentially to the people to abide by their laws and to govern in accordance with their laws under God. And because we're talking here about liturgy today, I think it's probably important to give you the oath of 1953, the most recent one. The Archbishop asks, will you solemnly promise and swear to govern the peoples of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, the Union of South Africa, Pakistan and Ceylon, and of all your other possessions and territories, to any of them belonging or pertaining, according to their respective laws and customs? I solemnly promise to do so. monarch under the law of those nations. Next question, will you to your power cause law and justice in mercy to be executed in all your judgments? I will. Will you to the utmost of your power maintain the laws of God and the true profession of the gospel, Mr. Christianeth? And will you to your utmost power maintain in the United Kingdom the Protestant Reformed religion established by law? More explicitly, will you maintain and preserve inviolably the settlement of the Church of England and the doctrine, worship, discipline and government thereof as by law established in England? And the answer is, all this I promise to do. Note that an oath to uphold the Church of Scotland as an established national church has already been made before the coronation in writing. Although I wouldn't be surprised if it came into this next coronation in the oral tradition. And will you preserve unto the bishops and clergy of England, and to the churches they are committed to their charge, all such rights and privileges as by law do or shall appertain to them or any of them? This is the independence of the church against the state. The Church of England is a state church, but this oath is the monarch being in a position to protect the church against any kind of overweening power of the state. Then the Queen arising out of her chair, this 1953, supported as before, the sword of state being carried before her, should go to the altar and make her solemn oath in the sight of the people. These things that I have before promised, I will perform and keep, so help me God. And she kisses the book and signs the oath. So that's a note which has developed enormously over the history of coronations, but it now firmly places the monarch under the law and under God, swearing to serve his people. The next thing you'll almost certainly see after the oath is taken is the presentation of a Bible. Now this was new in 1953, and really why it was added was because in 1953 was the first time that anybody remembered about the Church of Scotland, which is a national church and the monarch as head. So they thought we'd better give something for the moderator of the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland to do in the coronation rite. So they decided that he should give the Queen in 53 a Bible with such lovely words as the most valuable thing that the world affords, the lively oracles of God, and puts the Bible into the monarch's hands, then taken and put somewhere else. So I suspect the giving of the Bible will remain. There might be more than one person doing it. I suspect that in addition to the moderator of the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland, there might be the Cardinal Archbishop of Westminster in there as well as a more ecumenical gesture. So the giving of the Bible is not ancient and comes in through the Church of Scotland in the 1950s. So those are done, the acclamation, the oath, the giving of the Bible. Then we start the Eucharist, whatever rite might be being used. I suspect something very like the rite of 1662. There's the Kyrie, the Collect, the Epistle, a gradual psalm, a Gospel. There may or may not be a sermon, probably not, and the Creed. That's the liturgy of the Word, as we know it in our rite. And it could be in a number of rites that the Church in England has available to it, but I suspect 1662. Then we come to the most important core element of the rite, which is the anointing of the monarch. So the monarch is seated on the coronation chair. That's St. Edward chair, the wooden one, on the stone spoon, facing the altar with his back to the people. The robe of state is removed, and his hands and breast and crown of the head are all anointed with the chrism, which we've talked about. Traditionally, this has been hidden from view by a canopy held over the monarch, partly because of sensitivities arising from Queen Victoria's time, but also before, because of the bearing of the breast to receive the unction on the breast. Interesting of all the contraptions that will be used, the spoon with which the oil is poured is the only thing really to have survived the Cromwellian period. So the spoon you'll see used, if we get to see it at all, to ladle the oil, is the spoon from the Coronation Regalia dating back to the 12th century. More about the anointing of oil. We know that the Byzantine emperors were anointed with oil certainly from the 5th century onwards by the Patriarch of Constantinople. So from that eastern side, we know the tradition comes into Europe. But also we know that St. Cuthbert anointed Aidan as King of Balrea in the 6th century. So it came into the Scottish and then British rites in that way. So anointing is a very ancient part of the rite of coronation. And back in those days, it was regifacient, it made you the king, but now it's God's blessing upon the person who is the king. It's always associated with the text in the Old Testament of the anointing of David and Solomon. Hence the words that Zadok the priest anointed Solomon king, often set to music for that time in the rite. After the anointing, which is the most sacred part of the rite, when the monarch is stripped to just this white shirt, comes a whole series of investiture items coming from different parts of tradition. And you'll probably see all of these this May. The Colobium Sindonus is a white sleeveless garment in which the monarch stands naked before God. This is made anew every time. We knew that St. Edward the Confessor had a garment like this. Think of it as like an alb over which a deacon, priest or bishop would then put on vestments. So the Colobium Sindonus is the first thing to go on after the anointing. And then the Super Tunica. This is an ecclesiastical tunicle, as you might see in a set of chasuble, tunicle and dalmatic. And in fact, in the record of Richard I's coronation, it was called a dalmatic. So this is a sacred vestment going on to the monarch. Then, from the age of chivalry, we get spurs, because monarchs in the age of chivalry were knights. And then also because of the relevance in the past of monarchs of battle, the sword of state, which is offered to the monarch, received, and then laid up on the altar. Then the armils, which are bracelets, which we know from the scriptures King David wore as king. And then, more interesting for us, the stole, which we know is put on Byzantine emperors, and we know is worn by bishops, priests, and deacons in various ways. And then the imperial robe, which is essentially a cope, as we would know it ecclesiastically. So once you have that part of investiture done, you've got a monarch who looks like this: alb, dalmatic, stole, and cope. This is how sacred this part, once the person has been anointed, how sacred they are presumed to be. They're dressed almost like a bishop. Then some other temporal power signs come. The orb is a sphere with a cross, showing Christ's rule over the whole earth, the monarch being the person who has to institute Christ's rule over his or her part of the earth. Coronation ring is given, which is really a wedding of the monarch to the church or to Christ himself. It's not like with the Doge of Venice, a marriage to the nation or anything like that. It's part of the marriage between the monarch and higher powers. Then two scepters. Scepter with a cross, kingly power and justice, dating from the time of Edward VII, this one, with one of the Canon diamonds in it, and the rod with the dove. This is the rod of equity and mercy, because justice and mercy are the prerogatives of the monarch. Henry III, who built the Abbey we see today, had this built for the first time, the rod with the dove, but predated it in his annals back to the time of Edward the Confessor, as he was wont to do. His rebuilding of the Abbey was all about Edward the Confessor. So the monarch is now clad in all this almost episcopal garb, with signs of earthly power and clemency as well. Then we have the crowning. Crowns come about later in coronations, even though coronation means crowning. The Byzantine emperors didn't do it until fairly recently. In the West, the Holy Roman Emperor did it on Christmas Day for Charlemagne. Before that, there were helmets. Crowns are a late addition to the thing, but we know that's been happening since the time, certainly, of William the Conqueror, who was crowned in Westminster Abbey. When the king puts on the crown, then others put on their headgear as well, and guns are fired, and all sorts of things happen, noisy things. Not because that is the most important part of the rite. That's not why such noise is made then. You may hear guns going off all over London. It's because it's the end of the rite of coronation. So all the liturgic of coronation have been done by then. The final act is putting the crown on the monarch. The efficacious act is the anointing. The final act is putting the crown on the monarch, sitting with his back to the people, facing the altar. Then another chair is set up on the crossing, which has been elevated for the occasion for the homage. So this is usually facing the people, and individual members who are present in the Abbey come and pay homage to the newly anointed and crowned monarch. This takes a very long time, and that's why so much music has been commissioned for coronations to fill in the time of all this homage. And you can imagine when there were 4,000 people there, some up in the galleries who had to get down to the ground and pay homage. It took a very long time indeed. This time there'll be 2,000 people there, and it may be that some people pay homage on behalf of their sectors. You know, you for all the baronets, you for all the dukes. Maybe. There's been some promise that that might become shorter. Now come to an optional place, an optional part of the rite. If there is a queen consort, then she gets done after the homage. So she is anointed on the head only, because it's thought to be indiscreet to bare her breast, to anoint her on the breast. And she also is given a crown. Camilla will have Queen Mary's crown, and 2 sceptres, a sceptre with a cross and an ivy rod with a dove. So it looks as if she's getting all these things kind of second hand to the king, and that's really right. Because the theology of this is that the queen consort is really an extension of the king. I mean, she's not going to rule in her own right, she has no political authority, but as the two are one flesh, she's thought to be an extra arm of the king. So that's why she is anointed, crowned, and given 2 sceptres and a ring. So that will happen after the homage is paid to Charles III, probably, if tradition is kept with. You may ask later on about other consorts. Prince's consort never had any such thing at all. They were not considered to be the extension of their wives. They were just in the congregation of the Abbey and paid homage, often the first to pay homage, or nearly the first to pay homage. And the one exception to both of those things is the joint coronation of William and Mary, who were co-monarchs. A new coronation chair was made of similar size to the one we have today. They were put beside each other, and these things happened at the same time to them. They were co-monarchs. That was the only time that happened. But Camilla is clearly a queen consort, and all her anointing and investiture will happen, if tradition is kept, after homage is paid to the king, including by her. She is his subject. And then the rest of the Eucharist can get on with it. We're now at the offertory, so offertory anthems will be sung. The king will present a paten to present bread, and a chalice or flagon to present gifts to the altar, thereby in our Eucharist theology presenting himself as a living sacrifice. And the rite of the Eucharist continues all the way to the end, whatever rite that might be. Once everyone has received communion, all we've got to do now is leave. The monarch and the consort go into St. Edward's Confessor Chapel and change into more comfortable clothing. So instead of King St. Edward's heavy crown, the imperial state crown is worn, and the orb and sceptre are brought out again, and crosses, swords carried before them, which we see for the first time in this liturgy. The sword of state, the sword of ceremonial justice, the sword of temporal justice, and the blunt sword of mercy, carried in procession before the king and queen. I will say something about music and how that relates to liturgy, but I'll just stop at that point for any questions you might have at that point. Yes?
You mentioned the Cohen or diamond, controversial, one of the crowns.
I mentioned two diamonds. One is the Koh-i-Noor, and the other is the various Canon diamonds.
I think the Koh-i-Noor is from India, is that correct? And the Indians want it back.
That's correct. And it's in Queen Mary's crown, and that's one of the reasons why that crown is not being used, because it's too controversial.
I relate that to another coronation that's different from the ones you mentioned, in that it involved an English monarch going abroad, namely Queen Victoria in 1876 went to India to be crowned Empress of India. Does the Kohinoor diamond have anything to do with that event?
king.
Queen Victoria did not actually go to, she was crowned Empress of India in 1870, but she did not go
Never
to
been to
India.
India.
Queen Victoria never went to India. George V had a Durbar in 1911 where he actually went to India. And to my knowledge, he was the only king emperor crowned in India. But Queen Victoria never actually went to India.
I did once hear a lecture about her going there at NYU.
I don't believe she did.
Queen Victoria never went to India.
Yeah, no.
And on your subject of the diamond is still in the possession of the royal family and is contentious and it will not be used at this coronation.
I don't believe Queen Victoria ever went to Australia. She never went to Canada.
Yes.
I have a question about.
Was she not crowned Empress of India?
Yes, she was.
Yes, she was, but not in India.
In India, she was crowned Empress of India. You know, she was the monarch of many places where she never went. That's the entirety of it. I wanted to ask just about the people who were king but never had a coronation. I think Edward V, who was usurped by his uncle, of course, and then Edward VIII, who
Yes.
abdicated.
Yes.
Was there anyone else?
No, there were just those two. So
Those two, okay.
Edward the Fifth was usurped by the person who became Richard III, and Edward the Eighth was king, of course, and in the lead up to his coronation, planned for 1937, he abdicated, so he was never crowned. So two of them were never crowned. Yes,
You mentioned the 2,000 guests.
roughly.
Are they invited?
Yes.
Or they're not just who got online first?
No.
And the other things, what the choir boys yell, is there translation?
Yes, so what they should be yelling are these Latin words. When there's a queen consort, of yelling the queen first and then the king. So what we expect to hear is Vivat Regina Camilla, and then Vivat Rex Carolus. Long live Queen Camilla, long live King Charles. In that order.
And one last part, does everybody get to go up for communion for,
Yes.
and
All the baptized. All the baptized.
Well, stay out and hear maybe a broadcast in.
It will be live streamed, so people can watch on their homes, but also many parks around the world are doing a public screening. So there'll be people sitting in parks in various places watching it all on a big screen, depending on the time zone and how comfortable it is to be doing that. The kind of invited guests will be obviously the heads of the Commonwealth realms. Not the heads, the governors and governors general, and also the elected prime ministers. So they're an important part because they're part of the Commonwealth. And then also the other monarchies of the world, especially the monarchs of Europe, those amongst the invited guests. And then some very British people. But for the internationals, it would be international monarchies and representatives of the Commonwealth nations, and especially the Commonwealth realms. So there'll be a large part of the guest list. And all baptized Christians should be welcome to receive communion. There'll be a lot of people there who are not Christians, of course, from around the world. I'll say just a few things about music, and then we'll come back and we should end up. So they haven't announced which of the many Eucharistic rites they're going to use, but of the 12 pieces of music that have been commissioned for this coronation, 3 of them are a Kyrie, a Sanctus, and an Agnus Dei. So clearly these are to be used in the rite, but not a Gloria. Kyrie comes at the beginning of the rite, and according to 1662, the Gloria comes at the end. No new Gloria has been commissioned, but of course they could use an old one if they're doing 1662, which I suspect they are. The Kyrie will be sung in Welsh by the Welsh composer Paul Mealer. The English composer Roxana Panufnik has written the Coronation Sanctus, and Tarek O'Regan, who is an Englishman of Irish and Turkish extraction, has written the Agnus Dei, which will pay, he says, heed to his Irish and Eastern musical influence as well. So, 3 coronation parts of the Eucharist commissioned specifically for this coronation. And then they'll be published and free for other churches to use in their Eucharistic rites.
I had heard that there's a possibility there'll be a modification of the use of the scepters because they contained ivory, and the king being a naturalist, like I suppose a sensitivity to
The one that contains ivory is the one for the Queen Consort. It's the Queen Consort rod, ivory rod with the dove. I think it might date from the time of Mary of Modena, when new things had to be made for her as a Queen Consort. But that is contentious, but I haven't heard whether it's in there or not.
Yeah.
That is the one that the Queen Consort had used, the ivory rod with the dove.
We shall see.
We should see, yeah.
I've read that King Charles was going to pare down the ceremony. What aspects would he be allowed to kind of minimize?
One would be the homage. You would have representatives of the different groups paying homage rather than every individual who is in the Abbey. It's hard to see what else could go. I mean, he would have been able to do it not in the context of the Eucharist, but that would be so breaking with tradition that it would be unthinkable. And we know, because of the commissions of music, that it is going to be in the Eucharist with a Kyrie, a Sanctus, and an Agnus Dei. You could get rid of the epistle and the psalm and just have the gospel, if that's all you really need. You could get rid of some of the things in investiture, like armals and things, but that wouldn't save much time. The homage is the big thing for saving time.
I think you mentioned that there was a very heavy crown that Queen Victoria didn't wear, and maybe Queen Mary, I forget who the second queen was. But I think I heard that Queen Elizabeth II once wore, or more than once, a very, very heavy crown, maybe once a year or less, for very ceremonial occasions. That was very, you had to sit a certain way to make sure it sat right on her head and didn't break her neck or something like that. And I just wondered if you knew anything about that.
There are various crowns. I think when she was crowned, I think she was crowned with St. Edward's crown, which is the heavy one. But of course, not wearing it for very long, it's off for the Eucharist. And then she goes out with the imperial state crown, which is much lighter and can be built anew each time.
Okay, so I just want to ask a follow-up little question is, I don't know if you mentioned it, do you think Charles is going to wear that particular very heavy crown for
Yes.
a little while?
Yes,
Okay.
he will be crowned with St. Edward's crown, which dates from the reign of Charles II, but refers to St. Edward the Confessor, King of
Well,
England,
if
11th
his
century.
mother was able to wear it, maybe she'll be able to wear it too.
Anne Boleyn also wore it for a while.
Oh, my God.
Henry VIII was already king when he married her, so she wasn't crowned at the same ceremony he was. It was a subsequent ceremony, and remarkably, and without precedent, she was crowned using St. Edward's crown. So I hope that gives you an overview of what's kind of important and what's less important to see the wood for the trees on the 6th of May. A few last questions.
Did I hear correctly that you said that King Charles will bring the paten to the...
Yes.
Okay.
The monarch should bring a paten with bread and a flagon with some wine. So the monarch should present the Eucharistic elements. Yeah. Yes.
There's a French theologian named René Girard who has a theory about the role of scapegoats in society, and he talks about the role of scapegoats in monarchies, and that as monarchies evolved, they symbolically took on elements of a scapegoat in society. Is that symbolism used at all in European monarchies?
I'm speaking just about the Scottish, English, British ones. I don't see anything in the Scottish, English, British ones that look like that. No.
Is there a big finish, a big parade out and getting into...
There's a big parade out. The four swords, the King and the Queen, the national anthem is sung, and then there's going back to Buckingham Palace in the uncomfortable coach. The coach was made for George IV, I think, is the uncomfortable coach, but this time we have a much more comfortable coach for getting to the Abbey from Buckhouse, which is the one made by Australia for the Queen's Diamond Jubilee, which is a much more comfortable Australian apparatus. Okay, and I think if you have any particular things at the drinks, do ask me. So just asking a round of God Save the King.